Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause deals with the relationship between the national and state governments. This is the vertical distribution of power that we were talking about before. So first I want to give you the definition or explain to you what the Supremacy Clause is. And again, sometimes people get this wrong, and so I want to be very clear when I go ahead and explain this. And I want you to look at the lecture notes because there's all kinds of clues on the lecture notes about what I'm looking for if I ask a question about this. And you'll notice that the word legitimate is like italicized, underlined, and bolded. That's your clue that this is an important part of this concept. The Supremacy Clause basically says if there's any conflict between a legitimate action of the national government and legitimate action of a state government will be resolved in favor of the national government. Now this is key. What the Supremacy Clause doesn't say is that anytime there's a difference between the national and state government, the national government always wins, because if the national government is doing something that is not legitimate, then it won't win. So what do I mean by legitimate? There are certain things, as we talked about earlier, there are certain things that the national government is allowed to do. And there are certain things that the national government is not allowed to do. So for example, we talked before about educational policy. If the federal government passed a law that said all states must teach, let's say, must teach something, let's say algebra, before they teach English, I don't know, something that's stupid, but just anything. That the federal government has passed a law that says all states must go ahead and teach algebra before they teach, freshman English. And state governments had a different law. If that went to court, the federal government would lose. Even though there's this Supremacy Clause that says that the national government is supposedly more powerful than the state governments. Again, it's only if it's a legitimate action of the national government. And since educational policy is something that the states get to do, not the national government, that would be an illegitimate action, a not legitimate action on the part of the national government, and it would be a legitimate action on the part of the state government, and so the national government would lose. So that's not what we're talking about when we talk about the Supremacy Clause. What we're talking about is when the national government does something that's legitimate, that is something that it is allowed to do, and the state government does something that's legitimate, something that it's allowed to do, and those two things conflict with one another, the national government wins. The national government's decision winds up being the thing that survives. So let me give you an example of what I mean. We talk about medical marijuana. In 1970, the federal government passed something called the Controlled Substances Act. And the Controlled Substances Act, what it did is it regulated the interstate sale, transportation, and use of controlled substances, drugs. Now, so the government set a bunch of rules, and one of the controlled substances was marijuana. The federal government restricted and said you cannot go ahead and sell marijuana. That was part of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. Is this a legitimate action on the part of the federal government? Can they regulate the interstate sale or transportation of or use of controlled substances? Well, yes, it is. So be sure to circle that. Yes, it is. Now, California, on the other hand, California in 1996 passed something called the Compassionate Use Act. And what the Compassionate Use Act did is it said that it is legal in the state of California to go ahead and sell marijuana as a prescription, as essentially as medicine for certain kinds of drugs, for people who are suffering from glaucoma. Apparently marijuana is good for that. For people who are undergoing cancer treatments, apparently marijuana is helpful to them because, I don't know what the technical term is, but people under chemotherapy tend to lose their appetite, and people who smoke marijuana get what are called, again, I know the technical term, the munchies. And so what winds up happening is they're more likely to eat, and so doctors have prescribed marijuana for people undergoing chemotherapy. Well, Does the state have the right to regulate the intrastate? And when I say intrastate, I mean within the state of California alone. Does the state have the right to regulate the intrastate sale of prescriptions? Well, the answer is yes. Well, is that a legitimate power of the state? Yes, it is. But here's where we have this clash. So something that the federal government says is illegal, the sale of marijuana, and the state government says is legal, sometimes there's a clash. Now, you might say, well, marijuana is, what about marijuana that's just grown and sold in California? Does the federal government have a right to regulate that? Well, the courts have already said yes, that in a case like that, and this is bizarre, but it's true, if you grow marijuana in California and you sell it in California, that means that you're affecting the sale of marijuana in between the states, because now you're affecting interstate commerce by not participating in it. Yes, by not participating in interstate commerce, by growing your marijuana on your own, you are affecting the interstate commerce, and therefore Congress has the right to go ahead and rule. Now, if you're thinking that's crazy, or if you're thinking they must have been high when they came up with that ruling, I kind of agree. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is that the government has, the courts have said that the federal government has the authority to go ahead and regulate the interstate sale of marijuana. So now we have a problem. At the federal level, the courts have said, at the federal level, the federal government has the right, according to the courts, to go ahead and regulate the use of marijuana. And they say, no, you can't. Based on the Controlled Substances Act, they've said that that's against the law. At the state level, on the other hand, at the state level, the states have said, yes, you can sell marijuana for medicinal purposes alone. So now you've got a clash. You've got a clash between the federal government doing something legitimate, regulating controlled substances. At the state level, they're doing something legitimate. They're regulating prescriptions within their state. Now, what's the situation? If an individual is following the state law while at the same time breaking federal law, she can be arrested if the federal law is legitimate. And in this case, it is. And so what you've had is people who are going ahead and who are totally following California law. They have these dispensaries, right, where they're selling marijuana, and it's totally legal in the state of California. But what's happening is the federal government goes ahead and comes in and arrests them and says, you're breaking a law, but you're breaking a federal law. You're breaking a federal law. And so this is the key with the Supremacy Act. It's not just that the federal government always wins. If there's a conflict between the state and the federal government always wins. The way it works is if there is a conflict between a legitimate action of the national government, and that means something that it's allowed to do, and a legitimate action of a state, meaning something it's allowed to do, that conflict will be resolved in favor of the national government. And so in this case, the Controlled Substance Act winds up being, prevails over the Compassionate Use Act. In other words, there's a conflict, and the conflict is going to be settled in favor of the national government, and that's why if an individual is following the state law, they're selling marijuana, but they're doing it legally, they're following all the rules that are set up for the state of California, but at the same time they're breaking the federal law, they can be arrested if the federal law is legitimate. And in the case of medical marijuana, the courts have said that the Controlled Substance Act is legitimate. And that's how you can go ahead and be following the law in California, but go ahead and still be arrested by the federal government. Okay? So after this, we're going to stop here, and then we're going to go on to interstate relations, relationships between the states. Okay?